Right. Professor Swaran Singh, if I can come to you, sir. Prime Minister's visit is taking place at a very, very critical juncture, both as far as the region and the world is concerned. There is the Afghanistan crisis that has introduced new threats in the Indo-Pacific region. Then there is a pandemic in which we are in a very crucial stage, every country doing its best. How do you see, with these priorities, Prime Minister's visit gains greater importance?
Clearly, the pandemic, the focus on Indo-Pacific, and now Taliban taking over power in Afghanistan. All these three make India unusually significant as to how world has to tackle these three challenges that they face. So, in that sense, India being present in Washington D.C. With Prime Minister Modi being there attracts sufficient attention, not just in United States, but I'm sure beyond the United States as well, because India is seen as a major player in that sense. And as Ambassador Vishnu Prakash just mentioned, India is also emerging as a very significant destination for investments. So in multiple ways, I think there is a reason why India is becoming more important and why India is being engaged very differently. And very quickly, I think it's important to see how on the ground Indian diaspora also increasingly plays a very attractive role, making the presence of Indian Prime Minister far more effective and visible. Since 1980, for example, India's total population has doubled. But if you look at the number of Indians in United States during the same period, that has risen by about 12 or 13 times. So United States has also been a major destination for people of Indian origin and Indian citizens. And they have brought about enormous professional, educational, and financial success for themselves, making them not just visible, but also far more effective in terms of increasingly showcasing their participation and, in fact, leadership in United States politics. And we notice that there are Indians who are greatly celebrated in United States today. President Joe Biden's speechwriter is an Indian. Vice President also is of an Indian origin. So India is in many ways becomes far more visible and desired country to engage for United States. And that, I think, really going to redefine how India's comprehensive global strategic partnership has been conceived and what it can bring to the table. And I think repeatedly now mention is being made of how India can be a greater contributor to the global supply chains and production lines, particularly in areas like, sort of semiconductors. Mention was made of supply chains for raw materials for vaccines. So India is increasingly coming to the center stage in that sense, and the United States fully understands that. And it is also clearly underlying how, before Prime Minister undertook his visit to United States, President Macron decided to have a long conversation on phone with Indian Prime Minister. He's not spoken as yet to the US President so far. So I think in that sense, again, how other nations value India in that sense of a country to engage with can be seen in multiple ways. And I think that makes Prime Minister's visit to United States, and particularly I assume his joining the Quad summit and addressing the UN General Assembly, particularly an event of global proportions.
Okay. Professor Singh, how do you see the relationship, especially between the two countries, right in the last 2 decades, right from, say, Obama to Trump to now Biden?
Sure. Clearly, last 2 decades have seen, first of all, United States drifting from European focus to Indo-Pacific focus, because after collapse of Soviet Union and the fact that the Indo-Pacific littoral is the area where economies were growing much faster, and there was much likelihood of per dollar returns for investors around the world. So, and China's rise was another challenge. So, factors like collapse of Soviet Union, rise of China, and rise of economies in this region has brought United States from Obama time to focus on this region, which is where India is a large economy, rapidly developing economy with a huge sort of middle class here as consumers. So India has become both an attractive destination to invest and also important partner to participate in United States, ensuring that it is able to restrain China's kind of unrestricted rising footprint in that larger Indo-Pacific region. Bilaterally, of course, also relationship has almost transformed completely, with 4 foundational agreements being signed 2+2 mechanism of the defense and foreign ministers meeting annually. The last meeting happened in last November, for example. So the speed and scale of India-US relationship has completely transformed itself in the last 2 decades. And that showcases how increasingly they are building much more closer proximity. And as Ambassador just mentioned, sometimes it doesn't go very well with some of the neighboring countries of India. But that is what it is. And in that sense, I think what is important to underline here is that it's not just anymore limited to bilateral relations. United States and India today work together in various regional and global issues. Pandemic is one important issue. Terrorism is another important. Climate change is another issue where India has taken initiatives of International Solar Alliance, for example. So United States is engaging India not just at bilateral level, which is of great significance and has transformed, but increasingly sees India as a partner at regional and global level. And I think that is where there's a completely new kind of equation that India for the first time now shares with the United States. And that will be clearly reflected in how India engages both at the Quadrilateral Security Framework Summit meeting on Friday, how India's Prime Minister speaks to the UN General Assembly, and bilateral meetings with all various leaders during this visit to United States. So it's a very different kind of India that United States sees and wants to develop as a close partner of United States in ensuring United States global leadership. As Joe Biden repeatedly now says, America is back. So when America is back, it has to work with its allies and partners. And in those, I think India has really catapulted itself to be a very significant player and partner of United States in addressing all various issues that are challenges for the world.
Right.
And particularly, pandemic has highlighted what India can bring to the table as a pharmacy of the world. And in that sense, I think it's a very different kind of India that is today being looked upon by international community, which has great expectations from India.
Right.
Professor Singh, when one looks at trade and investment perspective, another important pillar when it comes to bilateral ties, how is that going to move forward?
I think we have a largest trade between United States and India. Of course, within that trade, a lot need to be rectified, and that can really push it forward. But investments I think, is a major focus now, with the sort of Make in India being a primary focus of India. India is interested in bringing more and more investments, particularly high technology investments into India. And that is why Prime Minister is meeting a whole lot of CEOs of top companies in the United States in his first leg of the visit. But within those investments, I think there are areas where India needs to particularly stress need to sort of implement some of the promises that have been made, and that would be cheap, clean, and renewable energy area, which is very critical for India's development and growth in future. And we had sort of almost from 2005 this contracts and agreements and MOUs signed of 6 nuclear reactors that United States was supposed to commission and sort of deliver to India, which for various hiccups have not been delivered. I think that is one area where we need to expand India's sort of working together with the United States, because we have otherwise been cooperating largely in nuclear power generation with Russia. And if our overall strategic relationship is drifting in that sense towards United States, then nuclear power generation should be one important area where we both need to demonstrate partnerships expanding on the ground. So that could be another area where we need to focus. But of course, coming climate change summit would also see that investments that United States is promising. You heard Joe Biden saying that the old promise again of 2005 of developed nations creating a climate change fund of $100 billion would perhaps be now fulfilled finally, which would mean primarily to help developing and least developed nations with technology and finance so that they can deliver on the promises they are making to ensure their carbon footprint reducing on the ground. So that could be another area where the United States and India will have to demonstrate in terms of finance and technology transferring to empowering India to move away from coal-based power generation to other renewable sources and then other things that we need to do on the ground to make technologies more efficient, more effective, to ensure that carbon footprint is reduced. So there are areas in economic relationship that I think also need to then begin to think about third country joint ventures.
Right.
And India and United States also go beyond the bilateral and start investing in other countries also.
Okay.
Right. And Professor Swaran Singh, just while we're talking about areas of engagement, especially between among the Quad members, we started the program with a lot of focus on the COVID pandemic challenge. And there, we remember in the virtual meet that took place in March this year, there was an understanding that each of the countries could use their respective strengths to boost vaccine manufacturing, for instance. India could focus on manufacturing, Japan and the US could focus on funding, Australia could play a part in boosting the supply chain. So that would also be a key area of focus when these leaders meet.
Indeed, recently the health minister of India has already said that India would be starting export of vaccines from next month and contributing to the World Health Organization's efforts at global level. You remember India was at one point in time supplying vaccines and medicines to nearly 100 countries. So India is going back to that engagement again. But when it comes to within Quad, India had promised in the 12th March summit meeting, which happened virtually, that India would be producing 1 billion vaccine doses for only Indo-Pacific littoral, which is where, as you mentioned, Australia would help in distribution and disbursement, Japan would help financially, United States would help in terms of raw materials being made accessible. So in that sense, that kind of burden sharing has already happened. How they can take it still further forward, because aim is that 40% of entire humanity should be vaccinated within this year, which is a very ambitious target. And of course, ultimately 70% of humanity has to be vaccinated, which means India has to develop new vaccines either indigenously or collaborate with other international sort of producers of vaccines and expand the production at domestic level. And that would require the production capacity within India, but also support of other nations to expand that production capacity. The immediate challenge for the whole world is pandemic. And I think to overcome that challenge, Quad could be a very good platform. And I think India would be making an important contribution as the pharmacy of the world in that sense. But of course, we also need to underline that this may not be the last pandemic. If you look at last 20 years, increasingly transnational diseases have come up as a major challenge, whether it's Ebola, Zika, H1N1, SARS and others. So world may be moving into a new phase where, issues like pandemics could become something which is regular, which is where India's role at World Health Organization as chairman of World Health Assembly becomes very significant. There's a lot of talk for almost a decade that WHO needs to be really transformed to gear up itself to treat pandemic as a potential challenge that could reoccur again and again. And again, India's role there would be very significant. And on those also, for example, making certain shared understanding with these major stakeholders in global decision making will be significant. So series of bilateral meetings that Prime Minister will have with all leaders during his visit to United States would have multiple issues on the ground as to what are the areas where India can sort of multiply its contributions at the global level. And pandemic is one challenge, but I think also building consensus on how to sort of restrain and finally perhaps recognize the Taliban regime. India has been trying to build global consensus on this as well. India has put certain benchmarks, both driven by our own national interests, which is that violence on the ground should end immediately. There should be no violence against people of Indian origin and Indian citizens in Afghanistan. People of Indian origin trying to move out of Afghanistan should be allowed to do so. And territory of Afghanistan should never be used against India. So these are Indian sort of specific benchmarks that India has put on the ground. And then, of course, there are larger benchmarks of minimum civility and norms of governance, human rights, particularly women's rights, etc. So India is also contributing to building that international consensus. In that case, again, these sort of face-to-face conversations become very significant, particularly because countries like Pakistan, particularly, but also China and Russia, are engaging Taliban in a very different fashion. So, how to ensure that global consensus is generated very, very effectively and vocally, so that a kind of clear message goes to Taliban as to what are the minimum benchmarks they must fulfill before any consideration to recognize them will be made. And I think a great example happened when Pakistan insisted to have, Afghanistan represented on the sideline foreign affairs, the foreign ministers meeting in New York during this General Assembly session. All nations, including India, refused. Likewise, when Taliban created interim government, they invited representatives from 6 countries. None of the countries responded. So in that sense, India's consensus is holding ground. Increasingly, one can notice India is contributing to building of that international consensus. And this visit will also be a great occasion to build that kind of bonhomie and friendship and common understanding with major world leaders, to send a clear and direct message to Taliban and those who are kind of supporting Taliban or trying to come closer and become great friends of Taliban. They should also get that message that international community stands together, and India stands on that side of the divide in that sense, and make sure that Taliban has to fulfill certain conditions on the ground, prove itself committed to those issues, not just in terms of central leadership of Taliban talking, but also cadres on the ground understanding and respecting those norms. And so there are a whole lot of issues of climate change, of pandemic, of terrorism, of investments, of economic cooperation that are all going to be really together in these multiple conversations that Indian Prime Minister will have during this very hectic visit to United States.
Right there. Professor Swaran Singh and Ambassador Vishnu Prakash there, thanks very much for joining us in the first half of this special presentation on Prime Minister's visit to the United States.